The door swung open, and Choi Tae-min's entire world stopped breathing. Not because of the woman in the hospital bed down the hall. Not because of the sterile smell of antiseptic clinging to his suit. But because of the little boy sitting by the window, humming softly, with a face so achingly familiar it knocked the air straight out of his lungs. Those eyes. His eyes. Staring back at him from a child he'd never met, in a room he was never supposed to walk into. "Grace," he whispered, and the name cracked on his tongue like it hadn't been spoken in years. Because it hadn't. My queens. Welcome to Epic Romance Stories. On today's episode, you'd get a dose of betrayal, power, romance, love, unexpected encounters, and beautiful beginnings. If this is your first time here, make sure to like, subscribe, click the notification icon to get a reminder when new amazing stories drop, and share this story to friends and family who you think would love to watch it. And also tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I love knowing where my girls are. Now, let's dive back into this amazing story. 3 years earlier, Choi Tae-min had been a different man. Or maybe the same man, just less broken. He ran Seoul's underworld the way other men ran corporations, with precision, silence, and a reputation that made grown men flinch when his name entered a room. But at home, behind steel gates and quiet gardens, he was just a husband who loved his wife more than he loved his own life. Grace Bennett hadn't planned on falling for a man like him. She'd come to Seoul as a nurse on an international exchange program, chasing purpose, not romance. But purpose had a way of leading straight into danger. She met Tae-min on a night she wasn't supposed to be near his world at all. A car accident, a bleeding driver, and a stranger in a black suit who refused to let her walk away without knowing her name. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he'd told her that night, blood still on his hands from a fight she never asked about. "I'm not afraid," she'd said, and she meant it. That was the problem. She should have been. Their romance moved like wildfire through dry grass, fast, consuming, impossible to contain. He gave her a world she never imagined. Silk dresses, private dinners overlooking the Han River, a ring that cost more than her family's house back in Savannah. But more than the money, he gave her devotion. The kind that made her forget every warning her friends whispered about men like him. They married in secret 6 months after they met. No public ceremony. No danger of exposing her to the enemies circling his empire. Just the two of them, a quiet officiant, and a promise that felt unbreakable. "I will never let anything touch you," Tae-min told her that night, his forehead pressed to hers. "Not my enemies. Not my past. Nothing." He kept that promise for exactly 11 months. Then came the night everything collapsed, the night a rival syndicate traced Grace's existence back to him, the night gunfire shattered the windows of the restaurant they were dining in, the night Tae-min made a decision he believed would save her life. "You have to disappear," he told her, gripping her shoulders so tight it hurt. "Not forever. Just until I clean this up. Until it's safe." Grace didn't want to leave. She screamed it, cried it, begged him to let her stay and fight beside him. But Tae-min was already a man drowning in guilt, already convinced that loving her had painted a target on her back. "If you love me," he said, voice breaking, "you'll let me protect you the only way I know how." She left 3 days later. No trace. No goodbye letter. Just an empty side of the bed and a silence that swallowed Tae-min whole. He searched for her quietly at first, then desperately, spending resources most men would spend hunting an empire. Private investigators. Old contacts. Favors called in from corners of the world he never wanted to touch again. Nothing. Grace Bennett had vanished like she never existed. Eventually, he stopped searching. Not because he stopped loving her, he never stopped, but because grief has a way of masquerading as acceptance. He told himself she was safe somewhere, living a life untouched by his darkness. He told himself that was enough. 2 years later, he met Ashley Coleman. She was nothing like Grace. Soft-spoken. Steady. A schoolteacher from a quiet Georgia town who blushed when he pulled out chairs for her and had no idea the man across from her once controlled the fate of an entire underworld. With Ashley, Tae-min found something he thought he'd buried forever: peace. He proposed 8 months into their relationship. She said yes with tears in her eyes, unaware that somewhere across the ocean, a woman she'd never met was raising a son with her fiancé's exact face. Tonight, Ashley was supposed to be waiting for him in a hospital room after a minor car accident. Nothing serious, just precautionary observation. Taemin had rushed through those hallways in a blind panic, pushing open door after door in his search for her room. Until he opened the wrong one. And found the past he thought he'd buried, staring back at him with his own eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. The hallway noise faded into nothing, no beeping monitors, no nurse's footsteps, no hospital announcements. Just Grace, frozen by the window, and Taemin standing in the doorway like a ghost that had wandered into the wrong life. Taemin. Her voice came out thin, barely more than breath. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on the boy, who had stopped humming and was now staring up at him with open curiosity, head tilted the exact way Taemin's used to tilt when he was thinking hard about something. How old is he? The words scraped out of him before he could stop them. Grace's hands trembled as she reached for the boy, pulling him gently closer to her side, as if putting a few extra inches between them would undo the last 30 seconds. Taemin, don't. How old, Grace? She swallowed hard. 2.5. The math did itself in his head, brutal and immediate. 2.5 years. She'd left almost 3 years ago. The timeline lined up perfectly, horrifyingly, with the last night they'd spent together before everything fell apart. He's mine. It wasn't a question. It was a man watching his entire understanding of the last 3 years crumble in real time. Grace's eyes filled, but she lifted her chin, refusing to look away from him. His name is Daniel. Daniel. Not a name Taemin had ever imagined for a son he didn't know existed. A son who had apparently been growing up somewhere in America, learning to walk, learning to talk, learning to hum quiet little songs to himself in hospital waiting rooms, all while Taemin mourned a marriage he thought had simply dissolved into silence. You were pregnant when you left. His voice was quiet now, dangerously quiet, the kind of calm that used to make his enemies more afraid than when he shouted. You knew, and you still walked away without telling me. I didn't know, Grace said quickly, desperately. Not until after. Not until I was already gone, already hiding, already terrified that if I came back, I'd be putting both of us in danger. So instead you raised my son alone. The words hit harder than he intended, and he watched her flinch. For 2.5 years, Grace. Do you understand what you took from me? Do you understand what you took from me? She shot back, and for the first time, real anger cracked through the grief in her voice. You put me on a plane in the middle of the night with nothing but a suitcase and a warning never to contact you again. You made that choice, Taemin. Not me. I made that choice to keep you alive. And I made mine to keep our son alive, she snapped, tears finally spilling over. You think it was easy? Raising him alone in a country where I had no family, no support, constantly looking over my shoulder because I didn't know if the people who came after us that night would ever find me again. Taemin's jaw tightened. Every instinct in him wanted to cross the room, wrap his arms around both of them, and promise he would fix everything the way he used to fix everything. But he was a different man walking through this doorway than the one who'd said goodbye to her 3 years ago. He had a fiancé down the hall. He had a life he'd carefully rebuilt out of the wreckage Grace left behind. And now that life was colliding with a truth he never saw coming. Ashley, he breathed suddenly, the name landing like a slap to his own conscience. His fiancée was still waiting, unaware that the love of his past had just resurfaced with his son in her arms. Grace's expression shifted, confusion flickering across her face. Who's Ashley? Before Taemin could answer, small footsteps padded closer. Daniel had slipped from his mother's grip and walked straight up to Taemin, staring up at him with wide, unafraid eyes, the same fearless curiosity Taemin remembered seeing in his own reflection as a boy. Are you my dad? Daniel asked, plain and unguarded, the way only a child could ask the question that had just shattered two adults' entire worlds. Grace's breath caught. Taemin knelt slowly, bringing himself eye level with the boy, his carefully built composure threatening to collapse entirely. Yes, he said softly, voice rough with emotion he hadn't let himself feel in years. Yes, I am. Behind him, he heard Grace exhale a shaky, broken sound, somewhere between relief and heartbreak. And somewhere down the hallway, Unaware that her entire future had just quietly unraveled, Ashley Coleman was waking up alone in a hospital bed, wondering where her fiancé had gone. My queens, I need you to pause right here for a second and drop a comment. If you were Grace, would you have told him the truth the moment you found out you were pregnant, or do you understand why she ran? I want to hear your honest thoughts before we continue, because what happens next is about to change everything. Taemin stood slowly, Daniel's small hand still resting in his, and for a moment he couldn't tell if the ache in his chest was joy or grief. Maybe it was both. Maybe there was no clean way to feel something this enormous. I have to go check on Ashley, he said finally, though every part of him resisted the idea of walking away from this room. Grace wiped her face quickly, composing herself with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent years learning how to hold herself together in front of her son. Go, she said. We're not going anywhere. He hesitated at the door. Grace, this isn't over. We need to talk. Really talk. I know. Her voice cracked on the words, but she held his gaze. I'm not running again, Taemin. Not this time. The walk down the hallway felt longer than it had any right to be. Every step away from that room felt like abandoning something sacred, and every step toward Ashley's room felt like walking toward a lie he hadn't meant to tell, but had been living anyway. When he pushed open her door, she was sitting up in bed, scrolling through her phone, a small bandage taped above her eyebrow. There you are. She smiled, relief washing over her face. I was starting to think you got lost. Something like that. He forced a smile, crossing the room to sit beside her, taking her hand in his. It felt different now. Heavier. Are you okay? Ashley studied his face, the way she always did when something felt off. She was perceptive in a quiet way, the kind of woman who noticed small shifts in tone before anyone explained them. You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, he lied. Just relieved you're okay. She let it go, exhaustion pulling at her expression, and within minutes she drifted into a light sleep, the sedatives from earlier still working through her system. Taemin sat there in the dim hospital light, staring at the woman he'd promised to marry, and felt the walls of two separate lives pressing in from both sides. He didn't know how long he sat there before his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Room 412. Come alone. We need to talk about Daniel's father, and it's not just you who should know the truth. His blood ran cold. He read it twice, 3 times, trying to make sense of the words. Someone else knew about Daniel. Someone who wasn't supposed to. He glanced at Ashley, still sleeping peacefully, then slipped out of the room, heart hammering as he made his way toward room 412, 2 floors down, a room he didn't recognize, in a wing of the hospital reserved for long-term patients. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open cautiously, every old instinct from his past life sharpening back to life. Inside, an older woman sat propped up against hospital pillows, her face pale, but her eyes sharp and unmistakably familiar. It took him a moment to place her, and when he did, the floor seemed to tilt beneath him. Mrs. Bennet, he breathed. Grace's mother. Hello, Taemin. Her voice was weaker than he remembered, worn down by illness, but the steel in it hadn't faded. I've been waiting 3 years to have this conversation. How did you know I was here? Grace called me the moment she saw you. She's been sitting in that room shaking for the last 20 minutes. She gestured weakly to the chair beside her bed. Sit down. There's something you need to know, and she doesn't have the strength to tell you herself. Taemin sat, dread pooling low in his stomach. What is it? Mrs. Bennet's eyes glistened, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. The night Grace left Seoul, it wasn't just your enemies she was running from. What do you mean? Someone from your own organization contacted her before she left. Told her that if she ever tried to come back, or if she ever told you about the baby, they would make sure neither of you survived it. Her voice broke. She didn't run from you, Taemin. She ran to protect you both from someone inside your own circle. The room seemed to spin. Every assumption he'd built his grief around, that Grace had simply chosen to disappear, that she'd made a unilateral decision to keep his son from him, collapsed into something far darker. Who? His voice was barely a whisper now, but it carried the weight of a man who used to make grown criminals tremble. Who threatened her? Mrs. Bennet looked at him with something close to pity. Someone you trusted. Someone who's still very close to you. My queens, I need you to sit with that for a second, because I promise you, what comes next is going to leave you speechless. Who? Taemin asked again, sharper this time, the old danger creeping back into his voice. Mrs. Bennet hesitated, her frail hands twisting the edge of her blanket. She never gave me a name. Just said it was someone who sat at your table. Someone who called himself family. Taemin's mind raced through faces, men who'd sworn loyalty to him over the years, men who'd shared meals in his home, men who'd held his son's photograph and never once mentioned they'd seen it before. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade ever had, because it meant someone close enough to threaten Grace had also been close enough to watch him grieve for 3 years and say nothing. He stood so fast the chair scraped against the floor. I need to see Grace. Taemin. Mrs. Bennet's voice stopped him at the door, softer now. Whatever you decide to do about this, do it for them. Not for revenge. She's spent 3 years terrified of losing everything. Don't let fear be the thing that defines the rest of this story. He nodded once, throat tight, and walked back toward Grace's room with a storm building behind his eyes. Grace was standing when he entered, Daniel asleep now against her shoulder, and the moment their eyes met, she knew. She could see it, the devastation, the fury, the grief rearranging itself into something new. You know, she whispered. I know you didn't leave because you stopped loving me. His voice broke on the words. I know someone threatened you. I know you carried this alone because you were trying to protect us both. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. I wanted to tell you so many times. I wrote letters I never sent. I dialed your number and hung up before it rang. Every single day, I wondered if staying away was still the right choice, or if I just wasted 3 years of both our lives. You didn't waste anything. He crossed the room and gently placed his hand against Daniel's small back, feeling the steady rhythm of his son's breathing. You kept him safe. You kept yourself safe. That's not something I'll ever be able to repay. What happens now? Grace asked, and the question held everything, Ashley down the hallway, the Empire waiting for him back in Seoul, a traitor still hiding somewhere among the people he trusted, and a son who barely knew his name. Taemin didn't have a clean answer. He wasn't the same reckless man who once promised to burn down the world for her. He'd built something new, something that included Ashley's gentle laugh and her quiet, uncomplicated love. But standing here, looking at Grace and the boy who carried his eyes, he understood that the life he'd built after her had always been standing on a foundation with a piece missing. I don't know everything yet, he admitted. But I know I'm not walking away from him. And I'm not walking away from you without understanding the truth, all of it. Grace nodded, exhaustion and hope tangled together on her face. Then I guess we're not done yet. No, Taemin said quietly, glancing down at his sleeping son. We're just getting started. Somewhere down the hall, Ashley stirred awake in an empty room, unaware that the man she loved was standing in the middle of a reunion that would rewrite both their futures. And somewhere out there, a traitor who once shared Taemin's table was about to learn that the secret they'd buried for 3 years had just clawed its way back into the light. The next morning came too fast. Taemin hadn't slept. How could he, with 2 women asleep in 2 different rooms of the same hospital, both waiting for a version of him that no longer fully existed? He sat in the hallway between them, phone in hand, staring at Mrs. Bennet's words until they burned themselves into his memory. Someone who called himself family. There was only one man who'd ever earned that title from him. Young Ho-suk. His second in command for over a decade. The man who'd stood beside him at his secret wedding to Grace. The man who'd wept, actually wept, when Taemin told him Grace had disappeared. It couldn't be him. It had to be him. Taemin's chest tightened with the sickening certainty of both truths at once. He called Ho-suk before the sun had fully risen. Boss. Ho-suk's voice was warm, familiar, the same voice that had talked him through 100 crises over the years. You sound terrible. Everything okay with Ashley? I need you to come to Atlanta. Taemin kept his tone level, testing. Today. A pause. Just half a second too long. Of course. What's going on? I found Grace. Silence stretched across the line, real silence, the kind that told Taemin everything Ho-suk's words never would. Then, carefully, too carefully, that's incredible news, Taemin. After all this time, she had a son, 2.5 years old. Taemin watched the hallway, his voice dropping. Someone threatened her the night she left Hosuk. Told her if she ever came back, or if she ever told me about the baby, neither of us would survive it. Someone she trusted enough to believe. The line went quiet again, and this time Taemin didn't fill the silence. He let it sit there, heavy and accusing, until Hosuk finally spoke. I did it to protect you. His voice cracked, all pretense gone. Taemin, listen to me. The syndicate that attacked the restaurant, they weren't finished. They had a man inside our organization feeding them information. If they'd known about a child, known there was a way to hurt you that deep, they would have used it. I told her to disappear because it was the only way to keep both of you alive. I never meant for it to last this long. You made that choice for me. Taemin's hand tightened around the phone until his knuckles went white. You took my wife. My son. 3 years of my life, Hosuk. And you let me grieve a marriage you knew wasn't actually over. I was going to tell you. When it was safe. I swear it. When was that going to be? 10 years? 20. Taemin's voice finally broke, raw and furious. I got engaged, Hosuk. I built an entire life on top of a lie you buried. There was nothing Hosuk could say to that, and they both knew it. Taemin ended the call without another word, standing alone in the hallway with a betrayal too large to hold in his chest. He found Grace awake when he returned to her room, Daniel playing quietly with a toy car on the bed beside her. She looked up, reading the storm on his face instantly. You know who it was. Hosuk. Saying it out loud made it more real, somehow. More painful. He thought he was protecting us. He was wrong. Grace's eyes softened with something like recognition, not forgiveness. Not yet, but understanding. I believed him completely. He came to me 2 days after the shooting, told me things only someone inside your circle would know. I didn't have a reason to doubt him. I don't blame you. Taemin crossed the room and sat beside her, close enough that Daniel abandoned his toy car to climb into his lap instead, small hands patting curiously at his father's tie. I blame myself for building a world so dangerous that the people in it thought lying to me was protection. Down the hall, Ashley was awake now too, sitting up in bed, staring at her phone with growing unease. 3 missed calls to Taemin. No response. A nurse had mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd seen him go into another patient's room hours ago and hadn't come back out. Something in Ashley's gut told her the ground beneath her engagement had already shifted, even before she had proof. Back in Grace's room, Taemin looked down at his son, really looked at him, memorizing the shape of his laugh, the way he tilted his head, the 2.5 years he could never get back, but refused to lose another day of. Whatever happens with Ashley, he said quietly, whatever happens with Hosuk, whatever happens with any of it, I'm not disappearing from his life again. Or yours. Grace reached over, her fingers brushing his for the first time in 3 years. Then I guess we really are starting over. Grace's fingers laced through his, and for the first time in 3 years, Taemin let himself believe it. Then his phone buzzed against the bed. A text. Unknown number. Nice speech. Too bad Hosuk wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Ask Grace what really happened to the man who followed her to Atlanta 6 months ago. Taemin went still. Grace felt it, the sudden tension in his hand, and looked down at the screen over his shoulder. The color drained from her face. Grace. His voice was low, careful, the calm before something breaking. What is he talking about? She opened her mouth, then closed it. Daniel, oblivious, giggled and reached for his father's tie again. But Grace wasn't looking at either of them anymore. She was staring past Taemin, toward the hallway, where a man in a dark coat had just appeared in the doorway of the nurse's station, watching them. Waiting. Taemin, she whispered, gripping his arm. We need to leave. Right now. Grace, who is that man? She didn't answer. She was already reaching for Daniel, pulling him against her chest, her eyes locked on the stranger who hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, hadn't looked away from their room since the moment Taemin's phone lit up. My queens, some secrets don't stay buried just because we're ready to move on, and sometimes the past doesn't knock. It shows up in the doorway and waits. Who is the man in the hallway? What did Grace never tell Taemin? And is Hosuk really the only person who's been lying to him this entire time? You'll have to wait for part 2 to find out, my queens. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss it, and drop your theories in the comments below. I want to hear what you think is coming. See you in the next story.